Welcome to the debate. Today, we are confronting a profoundly tragic and fiercely contested incident that occurred on January 7th, 2026 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm talking about the fatal shooting of a U.S. citizen, Renee Nicole Good, who was 37, by an ICE agent, Jonathan Ross, during this large-scale immigration enforcement action by the Department of Homeland Security they called Operation Metro Surge.
And what we're seeing here are two just fundamentally irreconcilable narratives. On one hand, you have the federal government, President Trump, DHS Secretary Noem, insisting this was self-defense, even labeling Good's actions as domestic terrorism.
Right. And on the other, you have local officials, video analysis, and eyewitnesses who strongly dispute that justification.
Good's actions during the confrontation with ICE agent Ross constitute a sufficient and imminent threat to justify the use of deadly force? Or was her killing an unwarranted act enabled by a very aggressive federal enforcement policy?
And I'll be focusing on the operational reality Agent Ross faced, specifically how his unique personal history informed his perceived fear, which is absolutely central to the legal standard of force.
And I'll be analyzing the objective physical evidence, the systemic policy failures that really created this volatile situation, and why the government's actions after the shooting, like restricting the local investigation, demonstrate an inexcusable failure of accountability.
So let's start there. The federal government's defense of Agent Ross, it hinges entirely on the agent's perceived imminent danger. DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, which of course oversees ICE, they stated publicly that Ross was, quote, fearing for his life after Good attempted to run them over by weaponizing her vehicle. To really understand the justification, we have to look at the legal threshold. It's a standard of objective reasonableness, which comes from the Supreme Court. The legal test isn't whether the action was perfect in hindsight. It's whether a reasonable officer dealing with that stress, those facts, would perceive the threat. In Ross's case, that perception was heightened by a documented, severe, and very recent trauma. Just 6 months earlier, in June of 2025, he was dragged 50 yards by a vehicle during an attempted arrest. He sustained significant injuries. This is a seasoned officer, a firearms instructor, a SWAT team member. He operates under a high-threat paradigm. Now, Good's SUV was stopped sideways leftward in the street. Agents approached, giving sharp commands, and her partner was heard yelling, "Drive, baby, drive." The immediate rapid movement of that vehicle in his general vicinity, whether it was in flight or attack, well, it could reasonably be interpreted as a recurrence of that prior life-threatening assault. In that split second, the use of lethal force, I would argue, meets the threshold of objective reasonableness.
That analysis, though, while it acknowledges the officer's past, it seems to inappropriately center a subjective fear over, well, clear professional conduct and objective reality. The evidence just overwhelmingly undercuts the claim of self-defense. We have multiple independent video analyses, which were confirmed by accounts that Mayor Jacob Frey and the Attorney General relied upon. And they corroborate that Good began driving forward while turning the steering wheel away from Agent Ross. She was moving in the correct direction of traffic, clearly trying to leave.
Okay.
Ross remained on his feet. He crossed to the driver's side and continued firing 3 shots as the vehicle passed him, including shots through the windshield. That sequence directly contradicts the claim that he was run over or even that he was in the direct path of an incoming threat. And what's more, the shooting appears to violate standard ICE and DHS use of force policies. These policies instruct officers to use deadly force only when necessary, and specifically to avoid intentionally and unreasonably placing themselves in positions in which they have no alternative to using deadly force. Policing experts have noted Ross deliberately stepped in front of the moving vehicle, all while holding a cell phone in one hand and his gun in the other. This suggests an officer-created danger, a tactic that removes the justification for lethal force because a safe alternative, just stepping back, was available.
The official response from the administration, denying local authorities access to evidence, it just underscores a systemic failure.
I understand the argument about officer-created danger, but the fact that Agent Ross moved into the vehicle's path, that has to be weighed against the immediate perceived threat of a non-compliant driver accelerating. Let's really focus on the timing. You argue he should have stepped back, but when Good began to accelerate, Ross had less than a second to process these conflicting signals. His agent's orders to stop, the partner's yell to drive, and the sudden movement of a 2-ton vehicle. In that context, retreating might have been seen as jeopardizing the safety of his other agents, especially if that vehicle is breaking the perimeter.
But that line of reasoning tries to excuse a tactical failure with a psychological profile. The policy is just so clear. If you put yourself in harm's way unnecessarily, you cannot use that self-created jeopardy as justification for deadly force. Think of it this way. The policy is essentially saying if you step in front of a moving train, you can't then claim you had no choice but to shoot the engineer. The video evidence shows that as Good started moving, she immediately turned the wheel to the right, away from Ross. When the vehicle's wheels are visibly turned away, the threat of being run over is negated. Ross positioned himself on the driver's side after the initial movement began. His decision to continue engaging from that close proximity, rather than just disengaging, it shifts the responsibility squarely onto him for creating a scenario where he felt he had to fire.
Even acknowledging the vehicle turning, the maneuver itself still constitutes an aggressive departure from a federal enforcement scene. Good was actively obstructing federal agents. We are asked to judge this by the standard of objective reasonableness, and an agent with his specific history of being dragged by a car doesn't need to wait for the vehicle to be perfectly straight and aimed directly at him. Any acceleration in his immediate proximity, especially coupled with the command, "Drive, baby, drive," from her partner, validates the perceived imminent threat. That statement, which was captured by the agent's own video, can reasonably be perceived as an order to initiate a vehicular assault, not just flee a traffic stop. And that changes the entire calculus of whether the agent's fear was objectively reasonable for him, given his recent past.
I see why you emphasize that verbal exchange, but let's shift from the immediate reaction to the systemic context, which is our second major contention here: policy failures and accountability. The conditions that led to this deadly interaction were absolutely set by aggressive federal policy. Operation Metro Surge was an immense show of federal force. This environment was just primed for violent confrontation, and it was compounded by what critics have highlighted as really inadequate training. The ICE training program was reportedly cut to a mere 47 days, a highly symbolic move referencing the 47th president. This shortening of training, especially for agents operating in these kinetic, rapidly evolving situations like showy sweeps in urban areas, it just invariably prioritizes aggressive enforcement over de-escalation tactics. It makes an outcome like the killing of Renee Good tragically predictable.
I agree the aggressive nature of Operation Metro Surge added volatility, but we have to be careful not to attribute the agent's immediate response to a generalized training issue. The operational failure on the ground was immediate and chaotic. Good's SUV was stopped sideways leftward on the street for several minutes before agents even approached, and it allowed 2 other vehicles to pass. She was clearly impeding a federal operation, whether she was doing it intentionally as a legal observer or just unintentionally. Her partner's deliberate engagement in filming, including antagonizing the agent, changed the dynamic from a routine interaction to a non-compliant obstruction. This voluntary intervention, coupled with the sudden acceleration, is what created the need for a split-second defensive decision.
Systemic problems, though, they transcend the chaos of that specific corner. The institutional response after the shooting is profoundly disturbing. In Minnesota, the state agency typically responsible for investigating officer-involved shootings is the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the BCA.
Right.
Immediately following the incident, the federal government acted swiftly to revoke the BCA's access to critical evidence: the agent's gun, his body cam footage, vehicle evidence. This isn't just bureaucratic friction. It represents a deliberate federal assertion of absolute jurisdiction over force review. It essentially chills any attempt at local accountability by the prosecutor or state officials. When the federal government unilaterally freezes out the local government from investigating the death of a U.S. citizen, public trust is just shattered. It creates an institutional vacuum of accountability that suggests federal authority is above any state and local review.
Including the agent's weapon, it falls under federal jurisdiction, particularly given the political climate where local officials like Mayor Frey were immediately issuing condemnations against the federal agency. Allowing a local investigation right away risks politicizing the evidence, compromising the integrity of the federal probe. While look, I don't defend the lack of transparency, the complexity of these interjurisdictional disputes and high-stakes federal operations often defaults to federal control to maintain the purity of the legal chain of custody.
That defense falls apart when you consider the lengths the federal government went to control the narrative of Renee Good's intent, which brings us to our third contention. Federal officials have tried to discredit Good by labeling her a domestic terrorist, a professional agitator, and referencing irrelevant aspects of her personal life, her poetry, her social media profile, her relationship history. This character assassination is completely unnecessary if the use of deadly force was in fact justified by objective evidence. If Ross was clearly run over, why did the administration need to spend resources convincing the public that a mother of 3 and a U.S. citizen deserved to be shot? Her mother, Donna Ganger, and her ex-husband confirmed she was a compassionate mother and writer, not a violent political activist. The focus should be entirely on the legal justification of the force used, not on defaming the victim.
I fully agree that the rhetoric used by DHS and the White House was regrettable and unnecessarily toxic. However, while legally irrelevant to the justification of force, the question of Good's intent is crucial to understanding the operational volatility. She wasn't a casual passerby. She stopped her car sideways for several minutes at 34th and Portland. Whether she was acting as a legal observer, as some state officials suggested, or simply obstructing the road, this voluntary intervention dramatically changed the context of the interaction. When you voluntarily inject yourself and your vehicle into a highly kinetic federal operation, your actions, especially non-compliance or sudden acceleration, will be interpreted through a heightened threat lens by the agents on the ground. It compels us to consider how quickly this scenario transitioned from observation to a confrontation where the use of the vehicle as a weapon became plausible in the agent's mind, regardless of her actual compassionate intent.
But the officer's mind is not the final arbiter. The physical evidence is, and the evidence suggests flight, not attack. We have video showing her moving away, and we have a policy prohibiting officers from creating the danger they then react to lethally. If the vehicle was moving away even quickly, the threat to Agent Ross was diminishing, yet he escalated the force to the maximum level. The tragedy here is rooted in the systemic failure that trained agents to escalate rather than de-escalate, which would have been standard in a non-federal scenario. The cutting of the ICE training program to 47 days likely removed the necessary emphasis on avoiding such aggressive, preemptive tactics.
Even if the training duration is a point of concern, the legal test remains fixed on that instantaneous reaction. If an agent traumatized by a previous vehicular assault sees a vehicle accelerate toward his vicinity in a highly chaotic federal enforcement zone, his actions are defensible under the doctrine of objective reasonableness. The state and local officials demanding accountability must also acknowledge the non-compliant, interventionist nature of Good's presence at the scene, which contributed directly to the volatility. This case forces us to examine the tightrope federal agents walk when operating aggressively in local jurisdictions.
And it forces us to ask why that operational aggression supersedes basic accountability. The core tragedy is that the federal government's political narrative, labeling a mother and U.S. citizen a terrorist, does not align with the physical evidence available. When an officer violates policy, unnecessarily places himself in danger, and shoots a fleeing civilian, the act cannot be defended as necessary self-defense. It is a lethal failure of policy, training, and accountability, particularly when the federal government immediately restricts independent investigation by local Minnesota authorities like the BCA.
This tragic outcome highlights the profound difficulty in separating the agent's legal justification, which hinges on his subjective experience of imminent threat, from the operational reality of the chaotic enforcement action. Agent Ross's split-second decision in a volatile environment created by both aggressive federal policy and voluntary civilian intervention will remain legally complex. The question is not simply, was she fleeing,
But was the fear that she was attacking objectively reasonable for this agent at that moment?
The case of Renee Nicole Good forces a critical examination of the use of force standards for federal agents and the absolute necessity of independent oversight. The profound tension between federal authority asserting absolute control and the demands for local independent oversight of a civilian death. It underscores the systemic crisis of trust this incident has fueled across the nation. And the ultimate decision on justice here has to hinge on facts and policy, not on the political expediency of defaming a victim.
As state and federal investigations continue to unfold, we are left with a deeper understanding of the complexity inherent in judging actions taken in moments of extreme stress. The conflict between subjective fear and objective policy remains at the very heart of this controversy, offering a critical lens through which to view federal power in local communities.
Please leave your comment